So I thought it'd be helpful to share my experience keeping the 2006 Yamaha 254 stroke outboards going for multiple seasons on my boat in Delaware. About 4 or 5 years ago, we took the boat out and ran it at full throttle, and it would run at about 5 minutes, for about 5 minutes, and then one of the engines would drop from 6,000 RPM to 4,800 to 52 to 4,800. Wouldn't stall completely, and the boat would obviously lose power. It only happened on one of the engines. So the big debate with my brother-in-law related to was this: he thought it might be electrical, a short, or a ground wire that was intermittently making contact and intermittently not making contact. Anyway, because I want to make the point that you can almost make the diagnosis of a failed fuel pump on the Yamaha outboard by a certain engine performance, and that is that it will run from idle up to full power for some number of seconds, a minute to 3 minutes, and then the engine that has a fuel pump problem will start to stall, will lose power, but not completely collapse. And what is happening, the low pressure fuel pump under the air intake delivery system is not able to keep up with resupplying the fuel in the VST tank. The VST tank looks like a canister on the side of the engine. It's approximately the size of a World War II canteen, and the low pressure fuel pump pumps fluid to the VST tank, and when you go from idle to full power, the high pressure pump within the VST pump supplies fuel to the fuel injectors, and it decreases the level of fuel in the VST tank to make it smooth. Meanwhile, the low pressure fuel pump resupplies the canteen looking device, the VST tank, to resupply it to make that whole process of going from idle to full power smooth. So we replaced the fuel pump a few years ago, and that was indeed the problem, and it wasn't the electrical problem. I ordered the fuel pump, just to give you the history. I went to a reputable marine dealer in Delaware, and they quoted $700 or $800 for the Yamaha fuel pump for the 2006 four strokes. But the guy said you can get them on the internet for about $150 to $200, and they're the same pump. I thanked him for his advice, and that was indeed my experience. I ordered the pump for that motor from the California Fuel Pump Company and matched it up and received the fuel pump, and we installed it. And that cured the problem. So 5 years later, in the other engine, I have a Power Cat with two 250 horsepower, four-stroke, 2006 year Yamaha motors. The engine did the same thing at the start of the year. We took it out in the bay, ran it full power. It ran for 3 or 4 minutes, and then the other engine that had not had the fuel pump replaced lost power, dropped to 4,800, 4,500, 5,200. We would idle it again, and I think when you idle it, the fuel pump is able to keep up and resupply the VST tank and fill it back up at idle when it's not under a full load or demand. So again, when you run the boat out in the bay in an open waterway at full power, it'll run for another 3 or 4 minutes before the fuel is depleted in the VST tank, goes down, and the engine will start to boggle down again, lose power, not completely stall. And so it had the exact same symptom, and I knew that the fuel pump on the starboard motor now needed to be replaced. So just to finish the machinations that we had with replacing that fuel pump this year, ordered from the same California company, received a good-looking pump, virtually identical to the pump that had been in the Yamaha 2005 motor. Really virtually couldn't tell a difference with the wiring or anything else. It's a high-quality product. So in the process of installing that on the, I'm going to say the left side of the motor, as the motor is facing forward anatomically. This is my left, this is my right. As the motor is facing forward, I'm going to say the left side of the motor contains the plastic air intake, which has to be taken off. You take the cowling off, you take the air intake off. It involves 10 millimeter and 12 millimeter bolts. And you need a universal joint to get to the one that's deep-seated in the power housing with the cowling off, because it's very hard to get to. So there's like 7 bolts and a couple that come in through the top of the cowling. But anyway, to get to the fuel pump, you take off the plastic intake that covers the side of the motor on the left side. And that's my tip for that. The 10 and 12 millimeter bolts. You can do it with all quarter drive sockets. And like I say, it helps to have a universal joint to get to the one bolt that's deep within the power housing. That's very hard to get to. We replaced the fuel pump, and it's a good time to replace the little cylindrical, there's a little cylindrical filter, tiny little plastic filter that's white and has a blue cap, directly from Yamaha. It's a cylindrical filter. It's about 1 inch big by 2.5 inches long, and it has this look. That has to be replaced. It's a 10 micron filter, and it's contained underneath the air housing that you've taken off. So you need to replace that while you're in there. Anyway, in the process of fixing the fuel filter and the fact that I think I had a lot of water in the gasoline at the start of the season, because the tanks were practically empty when I winterized the boat and stored it for the last 4 or 5 months. I think I got a lot of condensation and a lot of water in with the gas, and it was hard to tell if the engine was running because of the fuel pump problem or the gas problem or both. So we swapped out the fuel filters. We swapped out the main fuel water separator in the boat, and we managed to have a rough idling engine that would not rev at all, and realized that there are 2 fuses that are involved with the fuel delivery system on the 2006 motor. So on the right side of the motor, if you open the fuse box, they're actually labeled. There's labels on the fuse box. One is like a 20 or 30 amp fuse that goes to the fuel pump itself. And there's a tiny little 5 amp fuse that goes to the fuel primer or the fuel delivery system. So there's 2 little fuses that are right next to each other within the fuse box. And in my machinations of restarting the engine multiple times, I had blown the 5 amp fuse. And apparently, if you have a lot of water in your gasoline, it will tend to overload this little primer pump that brings fuel up to the low pressure fuel pump that is contained underneath the air housing unit. So just to clarify my nomenclature, I believe that the fuel pump contained within the VST tank that supplies gas to the actual injectors in the motor is called the high pressure fuel pump. Fortunately, I have not had to repair that or replace that. And the other one I refer to as the low pressure fuel pump is contained under the air intake housing. But if you're going to try to troubleshoot this system and you're going to fix the whole system, also look at those two fuses on the right side of the engine to make sure none of those are blown. So that's my advice for people troubleshooting difficult to start or running Yamaha motors that are running poorly at idle, or they run great at idle, they run great full speed, but then they lose power after a couple minutes. That's almost indicative in my mind that the fuel pump, the low pressure fuel pump, is failing. And a little bit different than a truck or an old, SUV, a Yukon. When the fuel pump, I believe, in an old truck or an old SUV fails, the truck won't start. And the engine sounds like it's starving for fuel. That is, it'll turn over and it'll almost catch, it'll turn over and it'll almost catch and turn over and almost catch. And you can tell the electrical system seems to be working, but it's not getting enough fuel. So in my experience, when a fuel pump fails in an old car or truck, the vehicle won't start. On the other hand, I think this particular low pressure fuel pump on the Yamaha motor, when it fails, I imagine there's maybe some tines inside of it, little centrifugal tines that break off, and the fuel is not able to maintain its maximum output to keep the VST tank supplied. So I think the fuel pump on a Yamaha motor, when it fails by being less efficient in terms of volume per minute flow, such that the engines will not run at full tilt because the fuel pump is starting to fail. But it's not like an all or nothing thing. I think the fuel pump fails when it fails to give the same delivery in terms of fuel in volume or gallons per minute, however you want to measure the volume flow of a pump, a little bit different than you might find in a vehicle. That's been my experience. So I hope that helps somebody. Thanks for listening.